Divorce is common. Marriage is not respected. Homosexuality is on the rise. Prostitution in the larger cities is rampant. Many people marry, divorce, marry, divorce, marry, divorce, and many people live together without the benefit of marriage. What culture am I talking about? Sound like us? Sound like the U.S. today? I'm actually talking about the Roman Empire of the first century. One of the things I think we get mixed up on sometimes when we look at the Bible's commands and we look at what the Bible has to say is we think, well, that was for their culture. Sometimes I don't think we realize just how close our culture is to their culture and how much human nature hasn't changed. That people still do pretty much the same stuff they've always done. And that the Bible isn't written to fit in with the culture. The Bible is written to change the culture. And so I want to turn to Matthew chapter 19, where Jesus is confronted by some of the Pharisees that are trying to trap him. They're trying to box him in on some questions about a controversial subject. And that subject was divorce. Anybody here ever had somebody ask you questions about divorce and you kind of felt like you were being boxed in? You know, that they had an agenda with the way they were asking questions. They were coming after Jesus and they were trying to get him to take sides on a debate that was going on at the time. And Jesus, is one of the things I love about our Lord, He's a Lord that breaks out of boxes. He's a Lord that thought outside of the box before thinking outside of the box was a phrase anybody used. And so we're going to see in Matthew chapter 19 that he changes the question and He answers their question in a very wise way. When Jesus had finished saying these things, He left Galilee and went into the region of Judea to the other side of the Jordan. Large crowds followed Him, and He healed them there. Some Pharisees came to Him to test Him, see, they're setting Him up. They asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason?" "Haven't you read," He replied, "that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one. Therefore what God has joined together, let man not separate." "Why," then they asked, "did man command that or did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away?" Jesus replied, "Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another woman commits adultery." The disciples said to Him, "If this is the situation between a husband and a wife, it's better not to marry." Jesus replied, "Not everyone can accept this word, but only those to whom it has been given. For some are eunuchs because they were born that way, others were made that way by men, and others have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it." All right, let's look at this and kind of look at some of the cultural background and what's going on. At this time, there are two main schools of thought about divorce and the Jewish world. There are two rabbis. There's one Shammai and there's one Hillel. Shammai reads the Old Testament command where it says, if a man finds something unpleasing in his wife, and then it goes on and talks about adultery, then he can, and it goes through the methods for divorce. Shammai looked at the passage that talked about unfaithfulness. And so he said it was only permissible to divorce your spouse for adultery. And that was where he came down on. And he was pretty legalistic about that. And he was pretty strong on that side of things. And then there was another one, Hillel, who said that focused on the phrase, becomes displeasing. Well, I'm going to flip it around because I don't want to get you guys in trouble. Ladies, has your husband ever done anything that displeased you? Yeah. I saw a couple raising 2 hands back there, yeah. Guys, y'all can admit it. Let's ask it this way. Let's ask everybody. Have you ever done anything that displeased your mate? You know? Yeah, okay, we can admit that. Under Hillel's teachings, that's grounds for divorce. His rabbinical teachings are very close to the law we have in the United States today that's no-fault divorce. You know, you can divorce for any old reasons. When my first wife filed for divorce, one of the first questions I asked the lawyer is there anything I can do to fight the divorce? Because I didn't want a divorce. And I found out that in the state of Indiana, all she had to prove was irreconcilable differences, and if she wanted a divorce and I didn't, and I wasn't willing to change my mind, and she wasn't willing to change her mind, guess what that is? That right there is an irreconcilable difference. So there you go. Any and every reason is legal in most states in America today, and any and every reason was what Hillel taught. And so they asked Jesus this question, and it's kind of a trap. Because if he sides with Shammai, then he's not going to be very popular with the crowd, and he's going to seem to be legalistic. If he sides with Hillel, then he's really undermining the nature of marriage. And he's really undermining the law. And so he's kind of in this trap, and that they try and catch him with that. And who's winning in their culture is seen by what the disciples say. Ultimately, Jesus is going to come down on which side? Which one does he say? Divorce for what reason? Unfaithfulness. So he's going to come down on the side of Shammai, and when he does, how do the disciples respond? Well, if that's the case, if that's the situation between a husband and wife, it's better not to get married at all. Basically, the disciples, these guys Jesus has been working with for a couple of years, when they are told, once you get married, you got to stay married, the disciples respond with what? Oh, I should have never got married then. Now, does that tell you something about the status of marriage in Judaism when the disciples are freaking out at the idea that they're stuck with their spouses? Are we getting the picture here? Are we understanding what the culture was like? We tend to think that things are terrible now and they've never been this bad before. Well, the reality is people have been people for pretty much since God created people, and people have been like this, and they've been selfish and problems for all this time. And so if this is a situation between a husband and a wife, it's better not to marry is where the disciples come down. So in their culture, they had their own version of no-fault divorce. This was going on. And it's interesting, why does it talk about the man divorcing his wife? Anybody know?
Women had no rights.
Well, in one sense, women didn't have any rights. Yeah, because they didn't have any resources, and so the women weren't looking to get divorces back then, because if you did, where'd you end up? On the street. But the flip side of that was, because that was the circumstances of a woman, it was actually easier for a woman to divorce her husband than it was for a man to divorce his wife. Because people understood that if a woman was going to divorce her husband, it must be a pretty serious deal because of everything she was abandoning. So a man had to write out a certificate of divorce and go through the paperwork. You know what a woman had to do to divorce her husband back then? Walk out the door. Just leave. If she left him, she divorced him. That was her option. So she had a little bit more freedom in one sense, but it was because she didn't have any resources in the other sense. And so he focuses on the men, because typically, because they have the resources and they got to keep everything, who was doing most of the divorcing? You know, the women would burn their toast, and the guy would sigh Hillel and boot her out the door. Something displeasing, you know. And so that was what was going on in the culture. And so they come to Jesus and they ask him this question: is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason? And Jesus answers by taking them a different direction. He takes them back to what's the purpose of marriage. And I heard a preacher, I wish I could remember who it was, on the radio one time. that said if you're asking the question, do I have grounds for divorce, you're asking the wrong question. The question we ought to be asking is there any grounds to continue the marriage? And only when you get to the point where you can't answer that question with a yes, should you be considering a divorce. Is there any reason to keep it going? Is there anything left there that we can work with? Is there anything that remains that we can build on? And Jesus, to show them that, he goes back to what was the purpose of marriage? What was it about from the beginning? He goes back to the beginning. He talks about God making them male and female, and the two becoming what? One flesh. Now, you got two people, you got one person. What has to happen for two people to become one person? Somebody's got to die. Does that feel like fun? And as the two become one, what happens is, on a daily basis, there's death. You surrender a little bit of yourself here. You surrender a little bit of yourself here. You surrender a little bit of yourself here. You surrender yourself a little bit here. And through that sacrifice, the two become one flesh. And that means bits and pieces of you, hopefully the bad bits and pieces of you get knocked off. Now, I have seen a few couples that it seemed like the evil one won out. You know, as the two became one flesh and they're one evil son of a gun together. You know, I've seen a couple like that. But typically, well, my neighbors, Glenn and Fern Frazier, been married forever. And they are two of the sweetest people I've ever met. I went to visit Fern in the hospital the other day, and I actually got there a little bit before Glenn, so I got to see Glenn come in and greet her. And Glenn walks in and walks around the corner of Fern's chair. And Fern looks up at him and says, "What are you doing?" And Glenn looks at her and goes, "Looking at you." And then they leaned in and kissed. 91 and 95, and they were acting like a couple of teenagers. Been married for 72 years. Now, has it always been that way? No, actually, I talked to Fern one day, and she said that years ago, her and Glenn actually separated. I was like, y'all separated? And she says, yeah, she said, I moved into the basement for 6 weeks. And I was like, okay. I said, what was it about? She said, I don't remember. Honey, what was it about? And I was like, I don't know. But they have their rocky spots. But eventually, you whittle away the rough spots. You whittle away those other things, and you become one. But to get there requires sacrifice. And let me ask some of you guys that are here that have been married a long time. Has there ever been moments in your marriage where to make things work, it felt like you had to die a little? Been there? It's funny, one of the couples that's been married, the oldest, is sitting up here going, yeah? Yeah, we've been there. And that's part of what it takes. And I think one of the reasons we're having problems with marriage in our society and in every society that's had problems with it is because of an unwillingness to sacrifice. And we try to stay entirely separate and be our own people after we're in this marriage. Now, most of the successful marriages I know, they have times where they're apart from each other, but they come back together, you know, because they got different hobbies and that. But there's almost more of an attitude in those of, well, I'll let you do your thing, and while you're doing your thing, I'll go do my thing. But it's not, I have to have my stuff. It's this working together. And it takes sacrifice. And guys, let me talk to you all for just a minute. Every time I've talked about this concept of sacrifice in every wedding I've ever done, and every premarital class I've ever put together, the guys, when I start talking about dying for your spouse, we're macho, tough, heroic dudes. And we're like, yeah, I'll die for him. And if I were to ask for hands to be raised of all you married guys, how many of you would die for your wife? Every one of your hands would go up. And that's not just because she's sitting next to you. You know, because that's the way we guys think. We'd lay down our lives for our wives. We'd lay down our lives for our friends. We're like that. We're heroes. The problem isn't when it comes to laying down our lives. The problem is when it comes to laying down the remote. It's not the big sacrifices that we struggle with. It's the little day-to-day ones that are the problems. I think that's true in living out our faith in Jesus as well. If somebody came up to any of us as Christians and said, deny Christ, we'd laugh at them. No, I'm not going to do it. But the little things are what trip us up. And so Jesus reminds them of the purpose to become one. And He reminds them of who put them together. When we accept that responsibility of being married, we enter into a covenant. Now, do you guys know the difference between a covenant and a contract? You got a contract with somebody. Who can end that contract? Either of the two parties. When can they end it? Whenever they pretty much want to. There may be things they have to do in the contract to be able to get out of the contract, but they can end it pretty much any time. That's how contracts work. And we've tended to view marriage in our culture as a contract. Marriage wasn't a contract. Marriage is a covenant. What's a covenant? Somebody might say it's a solemn promise, and that's true, but in the original culture, a covenant, the word to make a covenant is to cut a covenant. And the reason for that is, do you guys remember when you were in grade school and you would make a promise? And you would cross your heart and hope to die, and then later on some of us said, stick a needle in my eye. What did that mean? It meant if you broke your promise, you hoped you'd die and that somebody could stick a needle in your eye if you broke your promise. Originally, in the Old Testament, when they would enter into covenants, the way they would enter into a covenant is they would take an animal and they would cut it in half. And they would lay half of the animal over here, and they would lay half of the animal over here, and then they would walk between the halves of the animals. And this was a prayer to their, and other cultures did this besides the Jews as well. This was a prayer to their god or gods, that their god or gods would treat them like this animal if they broke the promise. Now, who can break the contract, the covenant? Who can break the agreement in this case? Only the God in charge of the covenant. You're bound by that. And so Jesus says, who's made the agreement here? God has. So who can separate it? God can. And so we need to look at that, and we need to understand that. Too often we're quick to get out of these things. Now, he gives grounds for that in the text, but we need to get back, as he did, to the foundation and what's going on here. So what's the problem then? And what's the solution? Well, they start off and they say, well, if that's true, then why did Moses command us to give them certificates and send them away? It almost sounds like the Old Testament said, oh, get rid of those wives of yours, give them a certificate and get rid of them. And Jesus says, oh, no. He says Moses permitted because of what? Hardness of heart. So what's the solution? Soft hearts. Who needs to soften their heart? I saw somebody mutter everybody back there. And that's true. Who needs to soften their heart in a marriage that's facing divorce, that's struggling? Both people in the marriage. And one of the things, and I think this is part of Jesus' strategy here, about taking them back to the beginning, what's one of the things that can help you save a marriage? Is to think about what? Why you got married in the first place. What does that do to your heart when you think about why you married this guy sitting next to you?
He's a pretty neat guy then.
Yeah, pretty neat guy, man. Can you see some of that still in him?
It's in there.
Yeah.
It's in there.
Are there some things that might have even improved?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I worked on
So you start thinking about those kind of things and your heart does what?
It's softer.
It softens. So to the people in the marriage, that's something that needs to happen. But I think there's somebody else who needs to soften their hearts. The Bible says that God hates divorce. Why does it say God hates divorce?
It's hard on moms.
It's hard on everyone. It's hard on the kids that go through it. It's hard on the people who are divorced. It hurts people. So if that's the case, then what is the church's response? And why do you think Jesus didn't just say, when the Pharisees said, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? What could he have just said? No. Next question. But he goes through this whole thing to talk about hard hearts. Why? So that we would know we need to do what? Soften our hearts. So what should our attitude be towards people who have been through a divorce? Soft hearts. What should our attitude be towards people who are going through marital problems? Soft hearts. We need to have soft hearts. We need to be compassionate. We need to be loving. I actually had somebody, when I was in my second marriage, and I got to be honest, I was scared to preach this sermon. I'm scared now about how this sermon is going to be received. Because you got a guy up here who's twice divorced and not married now preaching about marriage. And I would fully understand if some of you went, well, what did he know? And the honesty is, not a whole lot. But I can read. And I understand what God's saying here. Not necessarily been able to live up to it, but I can understand. And we need to have soft hearts towards people who've been through that. And I actually had somebody come to me while I was in my second marriage. And they didn't know why my first marriage ended. They didn't know how hard I fought to keep that marriage. They didn't know any of that stuff. But they came up to me during my second marriage and basically told me that I needed to divorce that wife and go back with my first wife. Now, the fact that my first wife had remarried and had a kid by that son, they didn't care that wife would have to divorce that husband and that kid would now be a child of a broken home and all of the consequences that would come. They didn't care. They just had their idea about what ought to be done. Now, is that a soft heart? No, and we need to have soft hearts and handle these things in a careful manner. They also didn't understand that the book of Deuteronomy says that once you divorce someone and remarried somebody else, to go back to the original spouse is an abomination. Where have we heard that word before? Oh yeah, that's the same one that's used for incest and homosexuality and all of these other things. So we need to be compassionate with these people and encouraging and loving. So if you're divorced and you're remarried, what should you do? Be faithful and be the best husband or wife you can to the person you're with. Try and make that one work. Try and make things work there. Have a soft heart. And go with that. And then there's another possible solution. If you're not married, he says what? The disciples are like, and I think they're objecting here and think this will kind of argue against Jesus' position and getting to soften his position. And they say, well, if it's like that, it's better to stay single. And Jesus basically says what? Yeah, that's an option. He says, not everyone can accept this word. What word? The option of being single. Not everybody can do that. Paul writes in Corinthians that it's a good choice, but there are some people who just can't do it. And so Jesus says, you can't, not everybody can do that, but there are some who are eunuchs because they're born that way, others are made that way by men, and others have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. And the one who can accept this should. So if you can handle that, that's a good option. And that's another choice. But those are basically our choices. We can either remain single or we can go into a marriage and we can be faithful. And that's where our choice is. Anything else displeases God. And it's a hard choice, but that's the choices we have. And we keep trying to come up with other options. Living together but not being married. Being married, divorcing married, divorcing married, divorcing married, divorces married. You know, just this serial monogamy thing. And I've actually heard it. It looks like the gay marriage thing is passing in a lot of places. And as some people said would happen, I actually saw an article this week arguing that we ought to allow marriage of multiple partners. Go back to polygamy. There's people arguing for that now. And there's all these options that people come up with, but God says you got two. Stay single, be faithful. Pick one. And that's the challenge for us. Does he say it's going to be easy? We've got some single people here today. Is being single easy? Anybody think it's... No, it's not, is it, Kenny? No, it's not easy. We've got some married people here today. Is being married and doing it the right way easy? Some of you may want to scoot a little farther away from your spouse before you answer. No, it's work. And you know what? And I talk to people who are in bad marriages, and you know what they say? This is hard. I talk to people in good marriages, and you know what they say? This is hard. I talk to people who are single, they say, this is hard. There are challenges and struggles to all of it. God said what he said, be faithful or be single. How do we do either one of those? In several places he says, my grace is sufficient for you. And we need to have soft hearts towards everybody involved and compassion towards them. Now, I don't know about you, but I finished that sermon and I think back over decisions I've made and how I got to where I am now, and I am thankful for God's grace. I'm thankful for the grace he offers towards me. I'm thankful for the grace I've seen displayed towards others. Because the reality is, if you're divorced, you need God's grace. The reality is, if you're in a marriage and you hope to make it work, what's it going to take? God's grace. And so I am so thankful for his forgiveness and for his love. And if you want to return that love to him and accept him as the Lord of your life, I encourage you to come as we sing our invitation.